Flotsam and Jetsam, a short story by Somerset Maugham. Norman Grange was a rubber planter. He was up before daybreak to take the roll call of his labour and then walked over the estate to see that the tapping was properly done. This duty performed, he came home, bathed and changed, and now with his wife opposite him, he was eating the substantial meal, half breakfast and half luncheon, which in Borneo is called brunch. He read as he ate. The dining room was dingy. The worn electro-plate, the shabby cruet, the chipped dishes betokened poverty, but a poverty accepted with apathy. A few flowers would have brightened the table, but there was apparently no one to care how things looked. When Grange had finished, he belched, filled his pipe and lit it, rose from the table and went out onto the veranda. He took no more notice of his wife than if she had not been there. He lay down in a long rattan chair and went on reading. Mrs. Grange reached over for a tin of cigarettes and smoked while she sipped her tea. Suddenly she looked out, for the houseboy came up the steps and, accompanied by two men, went up to her husband. One was a Dyak and the other Chinese. Strangers seldom came, and she could not imagine what they wanted. She got up and went to the door to listen. Though she had lived in Borneo for so many years, she knew no more Malay than was necessary to get along with the boys, and she only vaguely understood what was said. She gathered from her husband's tone that something had happened to annoy him. He seemed to be asking questions first of the Chink and then of the Dyak. It looked as though they were pressing him to do something he didn't want to do. At length, however, with a frown on his face, he raised himself from his chair and, followed by the men, walked down the steps. Curious to see where he was going, she slipped out onto the veranda. He had taken the path that led down to the river. She shrugged her thin shoulders and went to her room. Presently she gave a violent start, for she heard her husband call her. "Vesta!" She came out. "Get a bed ready. There's a white man in a prahu at the landing stage. He's damned ill." "Who is he?" "How the hell should I know? They're just bringing him up." "We can't have anyone to stay here." "Shut up and do as I tell you." He left her on that and again went down to the river. Mrs. Grange called the boy and told him to put sheets on the bed in the spare room. Then she stood at the top of the steps and waited. In a little while, she saw her husband coming back and behind him a huddle of Dyaks carrying a man on a mattress. She stood aside to let them pass and caught a glimpse of a white face. "What shall I do?" she asked her husband. "Get out and keep quiet." "Polite, aren't you?" The sick man was taken into the room, and in 2 or 3 minutes the Dyaks and Grange came out. "I'm going to see about his kit. I'll have it brought up. His boy's looking after him, and there's no cause for you to butt in." "What's the matter with him?" "Malaria. His boatmen are afraid he's going to die and won't take him on. His name's Skelton." "He isn't going to die, is he?" "If he does, we'll bury him." But Skelton didn't die. He woke next morning to find himself in a room, in bed and under a mosquito net. He couldn't think where he was. It was a cheap iron bed, and the mattress was hard, but to lie on it was a relief after the discomfort of the prahu. He could see nothing of the room but a chest of drawers, roughly made by a native carpenter, and a wooden chair. Opposite was a doorway, with a blind down, and this, he guessed, led on to a veranda. "Kong," he called. The blind was drawn aside and his boy came in. The Chinaman's face broke into a grin when he saw that his master was free from fever. "You more better, Tuan. Very glad." "Where the devil am I?" Kong explained. "Luggage all right?" asked Skelton. "Yes, him all right. What's the name of this fellow, the Tuan whose house this is?" "Mr. Norman Grange." To confirm what he said, he showed Skelton a little book in which the owner's name was written. It was Grange. Skelton noticed that the book was Bacon's Essays. It was curious to find it in a planter's house, away up a river in Borneo. "Tell him I'd be glad to see him." "Tuan out. Him come presently." "What about my having a wash? And by God, I want a shave." He tried to get out of bed, but his head swam, and with a bewildered cry he sank back. But Kong shaved and washed him, and changed the shorts and singlet in which he had been lying ever since he fell ill for a sarong and a baju. After that, he was glad to lie still, but presently Kong came in and said that the tuan of the house was back. There was a knock on the door, and a large, stoutish man stepped in. "I hear you're better," he said. "Oh, much. It's terribly kind of you to have taken me in like this. It seems awful, planting myself on you." Grange answered a trifle harshly. "That's all right. You were pretty bad, you know. No wonder those Dyaks wanted to get rid of you." "I don't want to impose myself on you longer than I need. If I could hire a launch here, or a prahu, I could get off this afternoon." "There's no launch to hire. You'd better stay a bit. You must be as weak as a rat." "I'm afraid I shall be a frightful bother." "I don't see why. You've got your own boy, and he'll look after you." Grange had just come in from his round of the estate, and wore dirty shorts, a khaki shirt open at the neck, and an old battered tear-eye hat. He looked as shabby as a beachcomber. He took off his hat to wipe his sweating brow. He had close-cropped grey hair. His face was red, a broad, fleshy face, with a large mouth under a stubble of grey moustache, a short, pugnacious nose, and small, mean eyes. "I wonder if you could let me have something to read," said Skelton. "What sort of thing?" "I don't mind, so long as it's lightish. I'm not much of a novel reader myself, but I'll send you in 2 or 3 books. My wife can provide you with novels. They'll be trash, because that's all she reads. But it may suit you." With a nod, he withdrew. Not a very likeable man, but he was obviously very poor, the room in which Skelton lay. Something in Grange's appearance indicated that. He was probably manager of an estate on a cut salary, and it was not unlikely that the expense of a guest and his servant was unwelcome. Living in that remote spot, and so seeing white men but seldom, it might be that he was ill at ease with strangers. Some people improve unbelievably on acquaintance. But his hard, shifty little eyes were disconcerting. They gave the lie to the red face and the massive frame which otherwise might have persuaded you that this was a jolly sort of fellow with whom you could quickly make friends. After a while, the houseboy came in with a parcel of books. There were 6 novels by authors he had never heard of, and a glance told him they were slop. These must be Mrs. Grange's. And then there was a Boswell's Johnson, Borrow's Lavengro, and Lamb's Essays. It was an odd choice. They were not the books you would have expected to find in a planter's house. In most planters' houses there is not more than a shelf or 2 of books, and for the most part they're detective stories. Skelton had a disinterested curiosity in human creatures, and he amused himself now by trying to make out from the books Norman Grange had sent, from the look of him and from the few words they had exchanged, what sort of a man he could be. Skelton was a little surprised that his host did not come to see him again that day. It looked as though he were going to content himself with giving his uninvited guest board and lodging, but were not sufficiently interested in him to seek his company. Next morning he felt well enough to get up, and with Kong's help settled himself in a long chair on the veranda. It badly needed a coat of paint. The bungalow stood on the brow of a hill, about 50 yards from the river, and on the opposite bank, looking very small across that great stretch of water, you could see native houses on piles nestling among the greenery. Skelton had not yet the activity of mind to read steadily, and after a page or 2, his thoughts wandering, he found himself content to watch idly the sluggish flow of the turbid stream. Suddenly he heard a step. He saw a little elderly woman come towards him, and knowing that this must be Mrs. Grange, tried to get up. "Don't move," she said. "I only came to see if you had everything you wanted." She wore a blue cotton dress, simple enough, but more suited to a young girl than to a woman of her age. Her short hair was tousled, as though on getting out of bed she had scarcely troubled to pass a comb through it, and dyed a vivid yellow, but badly, and the roots showed white. Her skin was raddled and dry, and there was a great dab of rouge on each cheekbone, put on, however, so clumsily that you could not for a moment take it for a natural colour, and a smear of lipstick on her mouth. But the strangest thing about her was a tic she had that made her jerk her head as though she were beckoning you to an inner room. It seemed to come at regular intervals, perhaps 3 times a minute, and her left hand was in almost constant movement. It was not quite a tremble, it was a rapid twirl, as though she wanted to draw your attention to something behind her back. Skelton was startled by her appearance and embarrassed by her tic. "I hope I'm not making myself too great a nuisance," he said. "I think I shall be well enough to make a move tomorrow or the day after. It's not often we see anybody in a place like this, you know. It's a treat to have someone to talk to. Won't you sit down? I'll tell my boy to bring you a chair." Norman said I was to leave you alone. "I haven't spoken to a white person for 2 years. I've been longing for a good old talk." Her head twitched violently, more quickly than usual, and her hand gave that queer, spasmodic gesture. "He won't be back for another hour. I'll get a chair." Skelton told her who he was and what he had been doing, but he discovered that she had questioned his boy and already knew all about him. "You must be crazy to get back to England," she asked. "I shan't be sorry." Suddenly, Mrs. Grange seemed to be attacked by what one could only describe as a nerve storm. Her head twitched so madly, her hand shook with such fury, that it was disconcerting. You could only look away. "I haven't been to England for 16 years, she said. "You don't mean that? Why, I thought all you planters went home every 5 years at the longest. We can't afford it. We're broke to the wide. Norman put all the money he had into this plantation, and it hasn't really paid for years. It only just brings in enough to keep us from starvation. Of course it doesn't matter to Norman. He isn't English, really. He looks English enough. He was born in Sarawak. His father was in the government service. If he's anything, he's a native of Borneo." Then, without warning, she began to cry. It was horribly painful to see the tears running down the raddled, painted cheeks of that woman with the constant tic. Skelton knew neither what to say nor what to do. He did what was probably the best thing. He kept silent. She dried her eyes. "You must think me a silly old fool. I sometimes wonder that after all these years I can still cry. I suppose it's in my nature. I always could cry very easy when I was on the stage." "Oh, were you on the stage?" "Yes, before I married. That's how I met Norman. We were playing in Singapore, and he was there on holiday. I don't suppose I shall ever see England any more. I shall stay here till I die, and every day of my life I shall look at that beastly river. I shall never get away now. Never." "How did you happen to find yourself in Singapore?" "Well, it was soon after the war. I couldn't get anything to suit me in London. I'd been on the stage a good many years, and I was fed up with playing small parts. The agents told me a fellow called Victor Palace was taking a company out east. His wife was playing lead, but I could play seconds. They'd got 6 plays, comedies, you know, and farces. The salary wasn't much, but they were going to Egypt and India, the Malay states and China, and then down to Australia. It was a chance to see the world, and I accepted. We didn't do badly in Cairo, and I think we made money in India. But Burma wasn't much good, and Siam was worse. Penang was a disaster, and so were the rest of the Malay states. Well, one day, Victor called us together and said he was bust. He hadn't got the money for our fares onto Hong Kong, and the tour was a washout, and he was very sorry, but we'd have to get back home as best we could. Of course, we told him he couldn't do that to us. You never heard such a row. Well, the long and short of it was that he said we could have the scenery and the props if we thought they was any good to us. But as to money, it was no use asking for it, because he damned well hadn't got it. And next day, we found out that him and his wife, without saying a word to anybody, had got on a French boat and skipped. I was in a rare state, I can tell you. I had a few pounds I'd saved out of me salary, and that was all. Somebody told me if we was absolutely stranded, the government would have to send us home, but only steerage, and I didn't much fancy that. We got the press to put our plight before the public, and someone came along with the proposition that we should give a benefit performance. Well, we did, but it wasn't much without Victor or his wife, and by the time we'd paid the expenses, we weren't any better off than we'd been before. I was at my wits' end, I don't mind telling you. It was then that Norman proposed to me. The funny thing is that I hardly knew him. He'd taken me for a drive round the island, and we'd had tea 2 or 3 times at the Europe and danced. Men don't often do things for you without wanting something in return, and I thought he expected to get a little bit of fun. But I'd had a good deal of experience, and I thought he'd be clever if he got round me. But when he asked me to marry him, well, I was so surprised I couldn't hardly believe me own ears. He said he'd got his own estate in Borneo, and it only wanted a little patience, and he'd make a packet. And it was on the banks of a fine river, and all round was the jungle. He made it sound very romantic. I was getting on, I was 30. It wasn't going to be any easier to get work as time went on, and it was tempting to have a house of me own and all that. Never to have to hang around agents' offices no more. Never to have to lay awake no more and wonder how you was going to pay next week's rent. He wasn't a bad-looking chap in those days, brown and big and virile. No one could say I was willing to marry anybody just to... Suddenly she stopped. There he is. Don't say you've seen me. She picked up the chair she had been sitting in and quickly slipped away with it into the house. Skelton was bewildered. Her grotesque appearance, the painful tears, her story told with that incessant twitching, and then her obvious fear when she heard her husband's voice in the compound, and her hurried escape. He could make nothing of it. In a few minutes, Norman Grange stumped along the veranda. "I hear you're better," he said. "Much, thanks. If you care to join us at brunch, I'll have a place laid for you." "I'd like it very much." "All right. I'm just going to have a bath and a change." He walked away. Presently a boy came along and told Skelton his tuan was waiting for him. Skelton followed him into a small sitting room, with the jalousies drawn to keep out the heat, an uncomfortable, overcrowded room with a medley of furniture, English and Chinese, and occasional tables littered with worthless junk. It was neither cosy nor cool. Grange had changed into a sarong and baju, and in the native dress looked coarse but powerful. He introduced Skelton to his wife. She shook hands with him as though she had never seen him before, and uttered a few polite words of greeting. The boy announced that their meal was ready, and they went into the dining room. "I hear that you've been in this bloody country for some time," said Grange. 2 years. "I'm an anthropologist, and I wanted to study the manners and customs of tribes that haven't had any contact with civilization." Skelton felt that he should tell his host how it had come about that he had been forced to accept a hospitality which he could not but feel was grudgingly offered. After leaving the village that had been his headquarters, he had journeyed by land for 10 days, till he reached the river. There he had engaged a couple of prahus, one for himself and his luggage, and the other for Kong, his Chinese servant, and the camp equipment, to take him to the coast. The long trek across country had been hard going, and he found it very comfortable to lie on a mattress under an awning of rattan matting and take his ease. All the time he had been away, Skelton had been in perfect health, and as he travelled down the river, he could not but think that he was very lucky. But even as the thought passed through his mind, it occurred to him that if he happened just then to congratulate himself on his good fortune in this respect, it was because he did not feel quite so well as usual. It was true that he had been forced to drink a great deal of arrack the night before at the longhouse where he had put up, but he was used to it, and that hardly accounted for his headache. He had a general sense of malaise. He was wearing nothing but shorts and a singlet, and he felt chilly. It was curious because the sun was shining fiercely, and when he put his hand on the gunwale of the prahu, the heat was hardly bearable. If he had had a coat handy, he would have put it on. He grew colder, and presently his teeth began to chatter. He huddled up on his mattress, shivering all over in a desperate effort to get warm. He could not fail to guess what was the matter. "Christ," he groaned, "malaria." He called the headman, who was steering the prahu. "Get Kong." The headman shouted to the second prahu and ordered his own paddlers to stop. In a moment, the 2 boats were side by side, and Kong stepped in. "I've got fever, Kong," gasped Skelton. "Get me the medicine chest and for God's sake, blankets. I'm freezing to death." Kong gave his master a big dose of quinine and piled on him what coverings they had. They started off again. Skelton was too ill to be taken ashore when they tied up for the night, and so passed it in the prahu. All next day and the day after, he was very ill. Sometimes one or other of the crew came and looked at him, and often the headman stayed for quite a long while staring at him thoughtfully. "How many days to the coast?" Skelton asked the boy. 4, 5. He paused for a minute. "Headman, he no go coast. He say he want you go home. Tell him to go to hell. Headman say, you velly sick, you die. If you die and he go coast, he catchy trouble." "I'm not thinking of dying," said Skelton. "I shall be all right. It's just an ordinary go of malaria." Kong did not answer. The silence irritated Skelton. He knew that the Chinese had something in mind that he did not like to say. "Spit it out, you fool," he cried. Skelton's heart sank when Kong told him the truth. When they reached their resting place that night, the headman was going to demand his money and slip away with the 2 prahus before dawn. He was too frightened to carry a dying man farther. Skelton had no strength to take the determined attitude that might have availed him. He could only hope by the offer of more money to persuade the headman to carry out his agreement. The day passed in long arguments between Kong and the headman, but when they tied up for the night, the headman came to Skelton and told him sulkily that he would go no farther. There was a longhouse nearby where he might get lodging till he grew better. He began to unload the baggage. Skelton refused to move. He got Kong to give him his revolver and swore to shoot anyone who came near him. Kong, the crew and the headman went up to the longhouse, and Skelton was left alone. Hour after hour he lay there, the fever burning his body and his mouth parched, while muddled thoughts hammered away in his brain. Then there were lights and the sound of men talking. The Chinese boy came with the headman and another man, whom Skelton had not yet seen, from the neighbouring longhouse. He did his best to understand what Kong was telling him. It appeared that a few hours downstream there lived a white man, and to his house, if that would satisfy Skelton, the headman was willing to take him. "More better you say yes," said Kong. "Maybe white man has launch, then we go down to coast chop-chop." "Who is he?" "Planter," said Kong. "This fellow say, him have rubber estate." Skelton was too tired to argue further. All he wanted just then was to sleep. He accepted the compromise. "To tell you the truth," he finished, "I don't remember much more till I woke up yesterday morning to find myself an uninvited guest in your house." "I don't blame those Dyaks, you know," said Grange. "When I came down to the prahu and saw you, I thought you were for it." Mrs. Grange sat silent while Skelton told his story, her head and her hand twitching regularly, as though by the action of some invisible clockwork. But when her husband addressed her, asking for the Worcester sauce, and that was the only time he spoke to her, she was seized with such a paroxysm of involuntary movement that it was horrible to see. She passed him what he asked for without a word. Skelton got an uncomfortable impression that she was terrified of Grange. It was odd, because to all appearance he was not a bad sort. He was knowledgeable and far from stupid, and though you could not have said that his manner was cordial, it was plain that he was ready to be of what service he could. They finished their meal and separated to rest through the heat of the day. "See you again at 6 for a sundowner," said Grange. When Skelton had had a good sleep, a bath and a read, he went out onto the veranda. Mrs. Grange came up to him. It looked as though she had been waiting. "He's back from the office. Don't think it's funny if I don't speak to you. If he thought I liked having you here, he'd turn you out tomorrow." She said these words in a whisper and slipped back into the house. Skelton was startled. It was a strange house he had come into in a strange manner. He went into the overcrowded sitting room and there found his host. He had been worried by the evident poverty of the establishment, and he felt that the Granges could ill afford even the small expense he must be putting them to. But he had already formed the impression that Grange was a quick-tempered, susceptible man, and he did not know how he would take an offer to help. He made up his mind to risk it. "Look here," he said to him, It looks as though I might have to inflict myself on you for several days. I'd be so much more comfortable if you'd let me pay for my board and lodging." "Oh, that's all right. Your lodging costs nothing. The house belongs to the mortgagees, and your board doesn't come to much. Well, there are drinks anyway, and I've had to come down on your stores of tobacco and cigarettes. It's not more than once a year that anyone comes up here, and then it's only the D.O. or someone like that. Besides, when one's as broke as I am, nothing matters much." "Well then, will you take my camp equipment? I shan't be wanting it any more, and if you'd like one of my guns, I'd be only too glad to leave it with you." Grange hesitated. There was a glimmer of cupidity in those small, cunning eyes of his. "If you'd let me have one of your guns, you'd pay for your board and lodging over and over again." That's settled then. They began to talk over the whisky and sparkler, with which, following the Eastern habit, they celebrated the setting of the sun. Discovering that they both played chess, they had a game. Mrs. Grange did not join them till dinner. The meal was dull. An insipid soup, a tasteless river fish, a tough piece of steak, and a caramel pudding. Norman Grange and Skelton drank beer, Mrs. Grange water. She never of her own will uttered a word. Skelton had again the uncomfortable impression that she was scared to death of her husband. Once or twice, Skelton, from common politeness, sought to bring her into the conversation, addressing himself to her, telling her a story or asking her a question, but it evidently distressed her so much, her head twitched so violently, her hand was agitated by gestures so spasmodic, that he thought it kinder not to insist. When the meal was over, she got up. "I'll leave you gentlemen to your port," she said. Both the men got up as she left the room. It was rather absurd and somehow sinister to see this social pretense in those poverty-stricken surroundings on a Borneo river. I may add that there is no port. There might be a little Benedictine left. "Oh, don't bother." They talked for a while, and Grange began to yawn. He got up every morning before sunrise, and by 9 o'clock at night could hardly keep his eyes open. "Well, I'm going to turn in," he said. He nodded to Skelton, and without further ceremony left him. Skelton went to bed, but he could not sleep. Though the heat was oppressive, it was not the heat that kept him awake. There was something horrible about that house and those two people who lived in it. He didn't know what it was that affected him with this peculiar uneasiness, but this he knew, that he would be heartily thankful to be out of it and away from them. Grange had talked a good deal about himself, but he knew no more of him than he had learned at the first glance. To all appearances, he was just the commonplace planter who had fallen upon evil days. He had bought his land immediately after the war and had planted trees, but by the time they were bearing, the slump had come, and since then it had been a constant struggle to keep going. The estate and the house were heavily mortgaged, and now that rubber was once more selling profitably all he made, went to the mortgagees. That was an old story in Malaya. What made Grange somewhat unusual was that he was a man without a country. Born in Borneo, he had lived there with his parents till he was old enough to go to school in England. At 17, he had come back and had never left it since, except to go to Mesopotamia during the war. England meant nothing to him. He had neither relations nor friends there. Most planters, like civil servants, have come from England, go back on leave now and then, and look forward to settling down there when they retire. But what had England to offer Norman Grange? "I was born here," he said, "and I shall die here. I'm a stranger in England. I don't like their ways over there, and I don't understand the things they talk about. And yet I'm a stranger here too. To the Malays and the Chinese, I'm a white man, though I speak Malay as well as they do, and a white man I shall always be." Then he said a significant thing. "Of course, if I'd had any sense, I'd have married a Malay girl and had half a dozen half-caste kids. That's the only solution, really, for us chaps who were born and bred here." Grange's bitterness was greater than could be explained by his financial embarrassment. He had little good to say of any of the white men in the colony. He seemed to think that they despised him because he was native-born. He was a sour, disappointed fellow and a conceited one. He had shown Skelton his books. There were not many of them, but they were the best on the whole that English literature can show. He had read them over and over again, but it looked as though he had learnt from them neither charity nor loving kindness. It looked as though their beauty had left him unmoved, and to know them so well had only made him self-complacent. His exterior, which was so hearty and English, seemed to have little relation to the man within. You could not resist the suspicion that it masked a very sinister being. Early next morning, to enjoy the cool of the day, Skelton, with his pipe and a book, was sitting on the veranda outside his room. He was still very weak, but felt much better. In a little while, Mrs. Grange joined him. She held in her hand a large album. "I thought I'd like to show you some of me old photos and me notices. You mustn't think I always looked like what I do now. He's off on his round, and he won't be back for 2 or 3 hours yet." Mrs. Grange, in the same blue dress she had worn the day before, her hair as untidy, appeared strangely excited. "It's all I have to remind me of the past. Sometimes when I can't bear life any more, I look at my album." She sat by Skelton's side as he turned the pages. The notices were from provincial papers, and the references to Mrs. Grange, whose stage name had been apparently Vesta Blaise, were carefully underlined. From the photographs, you could see that she had been pretty enough in an undistinguished way. She had acted in musical comedy and revue, in farce and comedy, and taking the photographs and the notices together, it was easy to tell that here had been the common, dreary, rather vulgar career of the girl with no particular talent, who has taken to the stage on the strength of a pretty face and a good figure. Her head twitching, her hand shaking, Mrs. Grange looked at the photographs and read the notices with as much interest as if she had never seen them before. "You've got to have influence on the stage, and I never had any," she said. "If I'd only had my chance, I know I'd have made good. I had bad luck, there's no doubt about that." It was all sordid and somewhat pathetic. "I dare say you're better off as you are," said Skelton. She snatched the book from him and shut it with a bang. She had a paroxysm so violent that it was really frightening to look at her. "What do you mean by that? What do you know about the life I lead here? I'd have killed myself years ago, only I know he wants me to die. That's the only way I can get back on him. By living. And I'm going to live. I'm going to live as long as he does. Oh, I hate him. I've often thought I'd poison him. But I was afraid. I didn't know how to do it, really. And if he died, the chinks would foreclose and I'd be turned out. And where should I go then? I haven't a friend in the world." Skelton was aghast. It flashed through his mind that she was crazy. He hadn't a notion what to say. She gave him a keen look. "I suppose it surprises you to hear me talk like that. I mean it, you know, every word of it. He'd like to kill me too, but he daren't either. And he knows how to do it all right. He knows how the Malays kill people. He was born here. There's nothing he doesn't know about the country." Skelton forced himself to speak. "You know, Mrs. Grange, I'm a total stranger. Don't you think it's rather unwise to tell me all sorts of things there's no need for me to know? After all, you live a very solitary life. I dare say you get on one another's nerves. Now that things are looking up, perhaps you'll be able to take a trip to England." "I don't want to go to England. I'd be ashamed to let them see me like I am now. Do you know how old I am? 46. I look 60 and I know it. That's why I showed you those photos, so as you might see I wasn't always like what I am now. Oh my God, how I've wasted my life. They talk of the romance of the East. They can have it. I'd rather be a dresser in a provincial theatre. I'd rather be one of the sweepers that keep it clean than what I am now. Until I came here, I'd never been alone in me life. I'd always lived in a crowd. You don't know what it is to have nobody to talk to from year's end to year's end. To have to keep it all bottled up. How would you like to see no one, week in and week out, day after day for 16 years, except the man you hate most in the world? How would you like to live for 16 years with a man who hates you so he can't bear to look at you? Oh, come. It can't be as bad as that. I'm telling you the truth. Why should I tell you a lie? I shall never see you again. What do I care what you think of me? And if you tell them what I've said when you get down to the coast, what's the odds? They'll say, God, you don't mean to say you stayed with those people. I pity you. He's an outsider and she's crazy. Got a tick. They say it looks as if she was always trying to wipe the blood off her dress. They were mixed up in a damned funny business. But no one ever really knew the ins and outs of it. It all happened a long time ago, and the country was pretty wild in those days. A damned funny business, and no mistake. I'd tell you for 2 pins. That would be a bit of dirt for them at the club. You wouldn't have to pay for a drink for days. Damn them. Oh Christ, how I hate this country. I hate that river. I hate this house. I hate that damned rubber. I loathe the filthy natives, and that's all I've got to look forward to till I die. Till I die without a doctor to take care of me, without a friend to hold me hand. She began to cry hysterically. Mrs. Grange had spoken with a dramatic intensity of which Skelton would never have thought her capable. Her coarse irony was as painful as her anguish. Skelton was young, he was not yet 30, and he did not know how to deal with the difficult situation. But he could not keep silent. I'm terribly sorry, Mrs. Grange. I wish I could do something to help you. I'm not asking for your help. No one can help me. Skelton was distressed. From what she said, he could not but suspect that she had been concerned in a mysterious and perhaps dreadful occurrence, and it might be that to tell him about it without fear of the consequences was just the relief she needed. I don't want to butt into what's no business of mine, but Mrs. Grange, if you think it would ease your mind to tell me what you were referring to just now, I mean, what you said was a damned funny business. I promise you on my word of honor that I'll never repeat it to a living soul. She stopped crying quite suddenly and gave him a long, intent look. She hesitated. He had an impression that the desire to speak was almost irresistible. But she shook her head and sighed. It wouldn't do any good. Nothing can do me any good. She got up and abruptly left him. The 2 men sat down to brunch by themselves. My wife asks you to excuse her, said Grange. She's got one of her sick headaches, and she's staying in bed today. Oh, I'm sorry. Skelton had a notion that in the searching look that Grange gave him was mistrust and animosity. It flashed through his mind that somehow he had discovered that Mrs. Grange had been talking to him, and perhaps had said things that should have been left unsaid. Skelton made an effort at conversation, but his host was taciturn, and they ended the meal in a silence that was only broken by Grange when he got up. You seem pretty fit today, and I don't suppose you want to stay in this God-forsaken place longer than you must. I've sent over the river to arrange for a couple of prahus to take you down to the coast. They'll be here at 6 tomorrow morning. Skelton felt sure then that he was right. Grange knew or guessed that his wife had spoken too freely, and he wanted to be rid as soon as possible of the dangerous visitor. That's terribly kind of you, Skelton answered, smiling. I'm as fit as a fiddle. But in Grange's eyes was no answering smile. They were coldly hostile. We might have another game of chess later on, said he. All right. When do you get back from your office? I haven't got much to do there today. I shall be about the house. Skelton wondered if it were only his fancy that there was something very like a threat in the tone in which Grange uttered these words. It looked as though he were going to make sure that his wife and Skelton should not again be left alone. Mrs. Grange did not come to dinner. They drank their coffee and smoked their cheroots. Then Grange, pushing back his chair, said, You've got to make an early start tomorrow. I dare say you'd like to turn in. I shall have started out on my round by the time you go, so I'll say goodbye to you now. Let me get my guns. I want you to take the one you like best. I'll tell the boy to fetch them. The guns were brought, and Grange made his choice. He gave no sign that he was pleased with the handsome gift. You quite understand that this gun's worth a damned sight more than what your food and drink and smoke have run me into, he said. For all I know, you saved my life. I don't think an old gun is an over-generous return for that. Oh well, If you like to look at it that way, I suppose it's your own business. Thank you very much all the same." They shook hands and parted. Next morning, while the baggage was being stowed away in the prahus, Skelton asked the houseboy whether, before starting, he could say goodbye to Mrs. Grange. The houseboy said he would go and see. He waited a little while. Mrs. Grange came out of her room onto the veranda. She was wearing a pink dressing gown, shabby, rumpled and none too clean, of Japanese silk, heavily trimmed with cheap lace. The powder was thick on her face, her cheeks were rouged, and her lips scarlet with lipstick. Her head seemed to twitch more violently than usual, and her hand was agitated by that strange gesture. When first Skelton saw it, he had thought that it suggested a wish to call attention to something behind her back. But now, after what she had told him yesterday, it did indeed look as though she were constantly trying to brush something off her dress. "Blood," she had said. "I didn't want to go without thanking you for all your kindness to me," he said. "Oh, that's all right." "Well, goodbye. I'll walk down with you to the landing stage." They hadn't far to go. The boatman was still arranging the luggage. Skelton looked across the river, where you could see some native houses. "I suppose these men come from over there. It looks quite a village." "No, only those few houses. There used to be a rubber estate there, but the company went broke, and it was abandoned." "Do you ever go over there?" "Me," cried Mrs. Grange. Her voice rose shrill, and her head, her hand, were on a sudden convulsed by a paroxysm of involuntary movement. "No, why should I?" Skelton could not imagine why that simple question, asked merely for something to say, should so greatly upset her. But by now all was in order, and he shook hands with her. He stepped into the boat and comfortably settled down. They pushed off. He waved to Mrs. Grange. As the boat slid into the current, she cried out with a harsh, strident scream, "Give my regards to Leicester Square." Skelton heaved a great sigh of relief, as with their powerful strokes the paddlers took him farther and farther away from that dreadful house, and from those two unhappy and yet repellent people. He was glad now that Mrs. Grange had not told him the story that was on the tip of her tongue to tell. He did not want some tragic tale of sin or folly to connect him with them in a recollection that he could not escape. He wanted to forget them as one forgets a bad dream. But Mrs. Grange watched the two prahus till a bend of the river took them out of sight. She walked slowly up to the house and went into her bedroom. The light was dim because the blinds were drawn to keep out the heat, but she sat down at her dressing table and stared at herself in the glass. Norman had had the dressing table made for her soon after they were married. It had been made by a native carpenter, of course, and they had had the mirror sent from Singapore, but it was made to her own design, of the exact size and shape she wanted, with plenty of room for all her toilet things and her makeup. It was the dressing table she had hankered after for donkey's years and had never had. She remembered still how pleased she was when first she had it. She threw her arms round her husband's neck and kissed him. "Oh, Norman, you are good to me," she said. "I'm a lucky little girl. To have caught a chap like you, aren't I?" But then everything delighted her. She was amused by the river life and the life of the jungle, the teeming growth of the forest, the birds with their gay plumage and the brilliant butterflies. She set about giving the house a woman's touch. She put out all her own photographs, and she got vases to put flowers in. She routed around and got a lot of knickknacks to place here and there. "They make a room look homey," she said. She wasn't in love with Norman, but she liked him all right, and it was lovely to be married. It was lovely to have nothing to do from morning till night, except play the gramophone, or Patience, and read novels. It was lovely to think one hadn't got to bother about one's future. Of course, it was a bit lonely sometimes, but Norman said she'd get used to that, and he'd promised that in a year or two at the outside, he'd take her to England for 3 months. It would be a lark to show him off to her friends. She felt that what had caught him was the glamour of the stage, and she'd made herself out a good deal more successful than she really had been. She wanted him to realize that she'd made a sacrifice when she'd thrown up her career to become a planter's wife. She'd claimed acquaintance with a good many stars, that in point of fact she'd never even spoken to. That would need a bit of handling when they went home, but she'd manage it. After all, poor Norman knew no more about the stage than a babe unborn. If she couldn't cod a simple fellow like that, after 12 years on the stage, well, she'd wasted her time. That's all she could say. Things went all right the first year. At one moment, she thought she was going to have a baby. They were both disappointed when it turned out not to be true. Then she began to grow bored. It seemed to her that she'd done the same damned thing day after day forever, and it frightened her to think that she'd have to go on doing the same damned thing day after day forever more. Norman said he couldn't leave the plantation that year. They had a bit of a scene. It was then that he'd said something that scared her. "I hate England," he said. "If I had my way, I'd never set foot in the damned country again." Living this lonely life, Mrs. Grange got into the habit of talking out loud to herself. Shut up in her room, she could be heard chattering away hour after hour, and now, dipping the puff in her powder and plastering her face with it, she addressed her reflection in the mirror exactly as though she were talking to another person. That ought to have warned me. I should have insisted on going by myself, and who knows, I might have got a job when I got to London, with all the experience I had and everything. Then I'd have written to him and said I wasn't coming back. Her thoughts turned to Skelton. Pity I didn't tell him, she continued. I had half a mind to. Perhaps he was right, perhaps it would have eased me mind. I wonder what he'd have said. She imitated his Oxford accent. I'm so terribly sorry, Mrs. Grange. I wish I could help you. She gave a chuckle, which was almost a sob. I'd have liked to tell him about Jack. Oh, Jack. It was when they had been married for 2 years that they got a neighbour. The price of rubber at that time was so high that new estates were being put under cultivation, and one of the big companies had bought a great tract of land on the opposite bank of the river. It was a rich company, and everything was done on a lavish scale. The manager they had put in had a launch at his disposal so that it was no trouble for him to pop over and have a drink whenever he felt inclined. Jack Carr, his name was. He was quite a different sort of chap from Norman. For one thing, he was a gentleman. He'd been to a public school and a university. He was about 35, tall, not beefy like Norman, but slight. He had the sort of figure that looked lovely in evening dress. And he had crisply curling hair and a laughing look in his eyes. Just her type. She took to him at once. It was a treat, having someone you could talk about London to. And the theatre. He was gay and easy. He made the sort of jokes you could understand. In a week or two, she felt more at home with him than she did with her husband after 2 years. There had always been something about Norman that she hadn't quite been able to get to the bottom of. He was crazy about her, of course, and he'd told her a lot about himself. But she had a funny feeling that there was something he kept from her, not because he wanted to, but, well, you couldn't hardly explain it because it was so alien, you might say, that he couldn't put it into words. Later, when she knew Jack better, she mentioned it to him, and Jack said it was because he was country-born. Even though he hadn't a drop of native blood in his veins, something of the country had gone to the making of him, so that he wasn't white, really. He had an eastern streak in him. However hard he tried, he could never be quite English. She chattered away aloud in that empty house, for the 2 boys, the cook and the houseboy, were in their own quarters, and the sound of her voice, ringing along the wooden floors, piercing the wooden walls, was like the uncanny, unhuman gibber of new wine fermenting in a vat. She spoke just as though Skelton were there, but so incoherently that if he had been, he would have had difficulty in following the story she told. It did not take her long to discover that Jack Carr wanted her. She was excited. She'd never been promiscuous, but in all those years she'd been on the stage, naturally there'd been episodes. You couldn't hardly have put up with being on tour month after month if you didn't have a bit of fun sometimes. Of course, now she wasn't going to give in too easily. She didn't want to make herself cheap. But what with the life she led, she'd be a fool if she missed the chance. And as far as Norman was concerned, well, what the eye didn't see, the heart didn't grieve over. They understood one another all right, Jack and her. They knew it was bound to happen sooner or later. It was only a matter of waiting for the opportunity. And the opportunity came. But then something happened that they hadn't bargained for. They fell madly in love with one another. If Mrs. Grange really had been telling the story to Skelton, it might have seemed as unlikely to him as it did to them. They were two very ordinary people, he a jolly, good-natured, commonplace planter, and she a small-part actress, far from clever, not even very young, with nothing to recommend her but a neat figure and a prettyish face. What started as a casual affair turned without warning into a devastating passion, and neither of them was of a texture to sustain its exorbitant compulsion. They longed to be with one another. They were restless and miserable apart. She'd been finding Norman a bore for some time, but she'd put up with him because he was her husband. Now he irritated her to frenzy because he stood between her and Jack. There was no question of their going off together. Jack Carr had nothing but his salary, and he couldn't throw up a job he'd been only too glad to get. It was difficult for them to meet. They had to run awful risks. Perhaps the chances they had to take, the obstacles they had to surmount, were fuel to their love. A year passed, and it was as overwhelming as at the beginning. It was a year of agony and bliss, of fear and thrill. Then she discovered that she was pregnant. She had no doubt that Jack Carr was the father, and she was wildly happy. It was true life was difficult, so difficult sometimes that she felt she just couldn't cope with it. But there'd be a baby, his baby, and that would make everything easy. She was going to Kuching for her confinement. It happened about then that Jack Carr had to go to Singapore on business and was to be away for several weeks. But he promised to get back before she left, and he said he'd send word by a native the moment he arrived. When at last the message came, she felt sick with the anguish of her joy. She had never wanted him so badly. "I hear that Jack is back," she told her husband at dinner. "I shall go over tomorrow morning and get the things he promised to bring me." "I wouldn't do that. He's pretty sure to drop in towards sundown, and he'll bring them himself." "I can't wait. I'm crazy to have them." "All right, have it your own way." She couldn't help talking about him. For some time now, they had seemed to have little to say to one another, Norman and she. But that night, in high spirits, she chattered away as she had done during the first months of their marriage. She always rose early at 6, and next morning she went down to the river and had a bathe. There was a little dent in the bank just there, with a tiny sandy beach, and it was delicious to splash about in the cool, transparent water. A kingfisher stood on the branch of a tree overhanging the pool, and its reflection was brilliantly blue in the water. Lovely. She had a cup of tea and then stepped into a dugout. A boy paddled her across the river. It took a good half-hour. As they got near, she scanned the bank. Jack knew she would come at the earliest opportunity. He must be on the lookout. Ah, there he was. The delicious pain in her heart was almost unbearable. He came down to the landing stage and helped her to get out of the boat. They walked hand in hand up the pathway, and when they were out of sight of the boy who had paddled her over and of prying eyes from the house, they stopped. He put his arms round her, and she yielded with ecstasy to his embrace. She clung to him. His mouth sought hers. In that kiss was all the agony of their separation and all the bliss of their reunion. The miracle of love transfused them so that they were unconscious of time and place. They were not human anymore, but two spirits united by a divine fire. No thought passed through their minds. No words issued from their lips. Suddenly there was a brutal shock, like a blow, and immediately, almost simultaneously, a deafening noise. Horrified, not understanding, she clung to Jack more tightly, and his grip on her was spasmodic, so that she gasped. Then she felt that he was bearing her over. "Jack!" She tried to hold him up. His weight was too great for her, and as he fell to the ground, she fell with him. Then she gave a great cry, for she felt a gush of heat, and his blood sputtered over her. She began to scream. A rough hand seized her and dragged her to her feet. It was Norman. She was distraught. She could not understand. "Norman, what have you done?" "I've killed him." She stared at him stupidly. She pushed him aside. "Jack! Jack! Shut up. I'll go and get help. It was an accident." He walked quickly up the pathway. She fell to her knees and took Jack's head in her arms. "Darling," she moaned. "Oh, my darling." Norman came back with some coolies and they carried him up to the house. That night she had a miscarriage and was so ill that for days it looked as if she would die. When she recovered, she had the nervous tic that she'd had ever since. She expected that Norman would send her away, but he didn't. He had to keep her to allay suspicion. There was some talk among the natives, and after a while the district officer came up and asked a lot of questions. But the natives were frightened of Norman, and the DO could get nothing out of them. The Dyak boy who paddled her over had vanished. Norman said something had gone wrong with his gun, and Jack was looking at it to see what was the matter, and it went off. They bury people quickly in that country, and by the time they might have dug him up, there wouldn't have been much left to show that Norman's story wasn't true. The DO hadn't been satisfied. "It all looks damned fishy to me," he said, "but in the absence of any evidence, I suppose I must accept your version." She would have given anything to get away, but with that nervous affliction, she had no ghost of a chance any longer of earning a living. She had to stay or starve, and Norman had to keep her, or hang. Nothing had happened since then, and now nothing ever would happen. The endless years, one after another, dragged out their weary length. Mrs. Grange, on a sudden, stopped talking. Her sharp ears had caught the sound of a footstep on the path, and she knew that Norman was back from his round. Her head twitching furiously, her hand agitated by that sinister, uncontrollable gesture, she looked in the untidy mess of her dressing table for her precious lipstick. She smeared it on her lips, and then, she didn't know why, on a freakish impulse, daubed it all over her nose till she looked like a red-nosed comedian in a music hall. She looked at herself in the glass and burst out laughing. "To hell with life," she shouted.